Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Aaron Stein, director of the Middle East program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Hello, Aaron, and thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
We are talking on Monday, and as per last week's agreement between Turkish President Erdoğan and Russian President Putin, the joint efforts of Syrian and Russian forces to clear out the Syrian Kurdish militia known as the SDF or YPG from areas along the Turkish border is supposed to be completed tomorrow, Tuesday, which would lead to the start of joint Russian-Turkish patrols there. But Turkey's foreign minister said this morning, Monday morning, that the YPG had yet to fully withdraw from the area. What do you expect to happen if they still haven't withdrawn by tomorrow's deadline?
I mean, it's a good question. And the answer is I don't really know. I think what makes Russia's dealings with Turkey different than the Americans dealing with Turkey is that Russia and Turkey aren't treaty allies. And so Russia retains sort of more coercive leverage over Ankara than the United States ever had. As a byproduct of the Turkish invasion, Operation Peace Spring, their concurrent, quasi-ceasefire negotiated with the U.S. Is that with Vice President Pence was that before the ceasefire was established, the SDF, YPG had invited the Syrian regime back in to certain areas. And what we're seeing, or at least what's been reported, is that in areas outside of the Turkish zone, but ostensibly in the Russian zone, is that you'll have 15 Syrian sort of permanent observation posts established along the Turkish-Syrian border. And you have Russians guaranteeing the security of the Syrian Arab Army or Damascus. And so will that be a hindrance to Ankara? I mean, it's unclear. We don't really know. It's unclear if that will be a hindrance to Ankara. They have shown a willingness to clash with the regime. We've seen that at the edges of the Operation Peace Spring zone. But my guess is that I believe that there's a Russian military delegation headed to Ankara today, is that they'll begin to hammer out the details of the joint patrols inside that 10-kilometer zone, inside the Russian zone. And you'll begin to see Turkish flags and Russian flags and some sort of convoy driving around in circles.
Okay, and a lot of people are mentioning the 1998 Adana Agreement in reference to Turkey and Syrian relations. How, if you could please explain that a bit to us, what it is and how it's playing into what's happening today, and particularly what it means for Turkey's relations with President Assad and Syrian government now.
Yeah, I mean, the Adana Agreement is essentially what I would call the biggest strategic security win of Turkish foreign policy. I mean, perhaps since, either the inclusion in NATO in 1952 or maybe the invasion of Cyprus in 1974. I mean, what it did was use coercive threats of military invasion throughout 1998 to force, Bashar's father, Hafez, to cease giving support to the PKK. Abdullah Öcalan used to live in Syria, had PKK training camps in the Bekaa Valley in what was then Syrian-occupied and administered Lebanon. And, he was able, Turkey was able, I should say, to flip Syrian policy on the PKK, resulting in the Adana Agreement. And the Adana Agreement is pretty straightforward. It's just essentially, it creates mechanisms for the two countries to cooperate on security issues. And in particular, it obligates the Syrian side not to give safe haven to the PKK. There are annexes that are not available. I mean, they're available online if you just sort of search for them, but they're not available on the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs website. But in Annex 4, it's what essentially it entails is that if, like, the Syrian state is unable to do these things, Turkey has the right to occupy, I believe, as much as 5 kilometers of Syrian territory. Now, clearly, in the agreements with Russia, reached, I guess, a week or so ago, they kind of doubled that. We've got out to 10 kilometers. It's immaterial. 5 or 10 kilometers doesn't really matter, because what it is Russia has essentially exacted upon Turkey a cost for its forthcoming joint patrols, which is the de facto recognition of Bashar al-Assad as the guarantor of Syrian security all the way out to the northeast, with the exception of like what is essentially a little kind of quasi-bubble built around the Operation Peace Spring area. But for the most part, just a reiteration of what the Adana Agreement already allowed in these joint patrols. And so it just takes us right up to the present. And we're going to see how that all plays out as I'm sure negotiations between Moscow and Ankara will continue. And how Damascus will figure into this is anybody's guess.
I had read that because Adana allows Turkey to perform cross-border attacks on Kurdish militants that Syria may be supporting or allowing, but no long-term presence, that it might not work for Ankara. But you're saying that it does, some annex or addendum to it does allow for a longer-term Turkish presence?
Well, I mean, if I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but like there's no specification. But the idea is, and the Russians have been clear about this, the Syrians have reiterated this, is that they see no role for foreign forces. Turkey is a foreign force. So I do expect at some culmination, what Moscow will ask of Ankara is to leave Syria. But I think it's important to focus on, like in examples of Turkish-Russian diplomacy over Syria, they've been willing to have iterative and sustained conversations. And here I'm talking about for the Constitutional Committee, for example, something that's relatively inconsequential, like the Constitutional Committee, even for people who are working on it full time, everybody understands probably isn't going to go anywhere because the way it's constructed essentially gives it gives the Syrian regime veto power over how that document can be written. And so Turkey is at the strategic disadvantage in that process. And the Turks know this. People who actually deal with this stuff in Turkey. But my point of bringing this up is it took two years to even get there. So like if you're looking at a long iterative process that begins sort of a week ago, we could be talking about years here, not just months or weeks. But that doesn't mean that eventually Turkey will leave. Eventually Turkey will have to leave. It's just a question of how and under what circumstances.
And speaking of the circumstances, what do you expect to happen to the YPG? There's talk of integrating them into the Syrian army. I think there are around 50,000 of them. And that would seem to be a gift to Russia and Syria, which then would have this Kurdish card to play to threaten Turkey or request favors. What do you expect to happen to the YPG?
I mean, we don't know. There's been talk of integrating them back into the Syrian Arab Army, but people who study Damascus for a living, which I do not, repeat over and over again, is that they do not tolerate, the regime will not tolerate people who potentially have foreign allegiances, in this case the SDF-YPG to the United States, and that challenge the legitimacy of the state. The state wants to be omnipresent, and the way that it exacts, the way that it enforces these sort of norms is through intimidation and violence. And so the SDF-YPG is going to face a rough ride. Their best play here is to try and get the best deal out of Moscow. But Moscow works in a triangle where it balances its own interests with Turkey, with its interests with the regime. My point of bringing all this up is to say that Moscow doesn't have the magic formula either. But my guess is that they'll try and squash them under command of the Syrian Arab Army. And when they do that, that's going to raise questions for Turkey. How do you define who is YPG? How do you define who of YPG could be copacetic to Ankara if they were like, Arab appendages off of the SDF? None of these things have been defined. This will complicate any further Turkish aggression. It will give Damascus some semblance of leverage over Turkey because it can turn on and off sort of like the PKK tap. Because Damascus doesn't have any love for Erdoğan or Ankara. Erdoğan and Ankara have sponsored a anti-Assad insurgency essentially since 2012. And they cannot tolerate sort of Turkey, like from a security standpoint, meddling in their internal affairs as they define it. Now, clearly, the Damascus is a brutal regime and not deserving of anybody's sympathy, but you can try and understand what they would think as they would approach these issues. And it's going to be very, very difficult as we move forward, which is why I always say, like, just judge this in probably years rather than weeks. I mean, we have a long way to go here.
So we can't really decide what. I mean, Turkey's offensive into northeast Syria seems to have as its goal to have eliminated the YPG entity along its border, but we don't really know yet whether it has significantly reduced Ankara's Kurdish problem. I mean, it may have just made it more complex and internationalized the issue.
Well, the issue has already been internationalized by the way that the SDF-YPG spearheaded the fight against ISIS. I mean, just look at the international outcry. I was in Brussels the day of the invasion. The Europeans weren't happy with it. I'm back on the east coast of the U.S. The Americans aren't happy with it. You know, you see congressional movement here to sanctions. You know, nobody is sort of happy with the outcome of the Turkish invasion, except maybe for Turkey. And, you know, even the Russians, you know, were very clear. They didn't want Turkey to occupy as much territory as they do as an outcome of Operation Peace Spring. Now, they've learned to live with it and they've tolerated it, but, you know, they wanted to keep them to 5 to 10 kilometers, whatever it is. I think Peace Spring goes out to the M4, which is, you know, somewhere between 20 and 30, depending on how you measure it and where. You know, it's not a very big piece of territory, but it's not inconsequential because, like, what it's done is it's broken the SDF project. But it's broken the SDF project of sort of political autonomy in ways that, like, are still being written. We're not exactly sure. You know, and the Kurdish problem that Turkey faces is largely internal to its own country. You know, it stems from, you know, PKK terrorism, PKK insurgency. And, you know, how Ankara chooses to deal with that is really up to Ankara. They've chosen 2 different paths at different times. We're in a military phase right now. They had chosen negotiations a couple of years ago. You know, a sensible policy would begin to envision negotiations again with the PKK, you know, but that's up to Turkish leaders if they want to grab that. And, you know.
Seems like you just moved a little bit away from the microphone. If you could just, what role does Syrian oil play in all this? Trump said, I think last week, that U.S. troops would be staying in Syria to watch Kurd-controlled oil fields. You tweeted last week that Trump's goal of monetizing Syrian oil is delusional, and that it would basically require a partitioning of Syria. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's delusional. It's probably illegal. It sets a terrible precedent, and it's just dumb. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. You know, what Trump has been bamboozled into supporting an open-ended American presence because it's bent around his long-standing and ill-thought-out and relatively poorly informed idea that the U.S., when it invades other countries, should plunder it to pay itself back. He's mentioned this about Iraq. And now he's doing it in Syria. I mean, I see all these estimates about Syrian oil fields and their production. Obviously, they're not very productive fields. The infrastructure is destroyed. I find that to be entirely irrelevant. You know, this is a strain of thinking in the U.S. Perhaps put into fast forward because of the withdrawal from the border with Turkey. That in order to in order to be able to realize American goals, which is to sort of get a transition away from Bashar and to simultaneously put pressure on Iran, it's to deny the regime and its backers, Russia and Iran, total victory, and to deprive the regime of the resources it needs to rebuild the state. So the thinking goes, keep the vital resources away from him, you keep the pressure on him, you maintain American leverage.
Why is this not a good idea?
Well, I mean, the U.S. is ostensibly in Syria to fight Islamic State. That's the legal justification for the deployment. Guarding oil fields is illegal, if you ask me, although they've pretended that the idea is to guard them from ISIS. 2, it's fictitious. You know, the costs of Syrian reconstruction will not be subsidized by oil fields that are basically out of commission. That's an added cost for the regime and the Russians to rebuild as part of a broader reconstruction effort. You know, And this idea that you could build a spur off of these oil fields, I believe, that oil field is out of commission. But the Turks would have a say about that, and they're not going to allow at least the independent pumping of Kurdish oil and its export through Ceyhan. They don't want to see sort of a rump proto-Kurdish state get funded through oil exports. So this is a fantastical and absurd American policy, but it fits the needs of those who want to retain a presence. And so the difference now in American policy is that Trump didn't favor an open-ended presence in Syria's northeast. He's made very clear he doesn't want to be in the middle of Turks and Kurds fighting, but he has been very open and excited about the idea of taking Syria's oil, which again is a farce, but he supports this. And so you have top-level and top-down political support for what will be the deployment of mechanized U.S. forces, regular forces, not just special forces, to a sort of strategic backwater in Syria, where the U.S. will be obligated to defend.
Mm-hmm. On Sunday, Trump announced the killing of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who he said detonated a suicide vest as U.S. troops and military dogs, closed in on him. The killing of Baghdadi near the Turkish border in Idlib, I think 5 or 8 miles away from the Turkish border, seems to fly in the face of so much of what Trump has said in the past couple of weeks, particularly about the handing over of counter-ISIS duties to Turkey. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, it confirms elements of U.S. assessments of the non-SDF areas. I mean, people are always asking, like the broader question is, how do we end up in this place? How do we end up in that the U.S. was essentially in bed with the YPG, and the Turks are hostile to this? So the alliance with Turkey has frayed to the point of almost breaking. Whereas, were there other options available? Like, were there Turkish-supported groups that were available to prosecute the war against ISIS? And one of the main concerns on the U.S. side is that these Turkish-supported groups were fractured. They had inside of them, they had groups that weren't ISIS per se, but were maybe closer to some of the extremist groups that are operating in Idlib.
Al-Qaeda linked or Islamist or jihadis, yeah.
I mean, look, there are people debate how we define them. I would just say that these people aren't those that would pass muster for U.S. vetting. Mm-hmm. And that's acceptable. But one thing that the SDF did, because it is YPG and YPG is PKK and PKK is a very homogenous top-down group, is that when they secured areas, the areas were secured. Now, one of the things that happened as the SDF grew and we got up to that 50,000 number, allegedly, that you cited at the top. I'm not sure how many are really in there. Is that they brought on people, and so as you bring on more people, you increase the amount of corruption that goes inside the group. And so this corruption can feed instability, particularly in areas that are far away from the core Kurdish areas up on the border. Now, just interesting, and we've seen that. I mean, but now intersperse that on top of the Turkish zones, where the control is fragile, it's split between multiple militias, corruption is high. It creates space for men and material to be smuggled, and to live in relative anonymity, and that is probably how Baghdadi ended up on the border with Turkey. It's a relatively safe space up there for him. Well, not safe enough, right? But it's safer to be in Idlib than it would be down in Baghouz or part of the Middle Euphrates River Valley, where there are significant U.S. assets dedicated to hunting for him. And, the U.S. ultimately tracked him down according to reports, significant assistance from the Iraqi intelligence services, sort of assists, as the U.S. calls them, from the SDF YPG. The U.S. got him. But it raises uncomfortable questions. I mean, these are more questions for the Turks and the Russians, if you ask me, is that they're going to have to deal with sort of these pockets of nasty dudes, whoever they're linked to. Basically, if you ask me, in perpetuity, as the U.S. withdraws, now intermittently to a small little bastion down there on the Iraqi-Syrian border by oil fields, and the Turks and the Russians and the regime and the Iranians take over the effort up along the northeast. Good luck to them. It's going to be difficult, and this is going to absorb a lot of capacity on both of these, on the Turks, the Russians, the Iranians, and the regime side, as they try and grapple with this.
Mm-hmm. Turkey's offensive in northeast Syria has displaced somewhere around 150, 170,000 people, and many observers, including former U.S. Ambassador Samantha Power, have described what Ankara is doing in the area as ethnic cleansing, in part because Erdoğan has repeatedly expressed his desire to settle up to 2 million mostly Arab Syrian refugees in this area, much of which has been Kurdish, predominantly Kurdish in recent decades. What's your view of that sort of assessment?
War is nasty. If you listen to Turks, the PYD, PKK, and you can, again, understand where they're coming from, is a strategic threat to them in ways that challenges in their minds, and again, it's not really up to me, the territorial integrity of the Turkish state. Now, I don't agree with this assessment, but it's not really up to me. It's up to the people who make the decisions in Ankara. And so as they swept the YPG off the border, war is violent. It requires heavy artillery. It requires airstrikes. And you sweep people off and people leave. The point is that Turkey didn't care enough that it would displace enough people for them to stop the invasion. Which should give a sort of hint into the Turkish sort of national security elite about what it is that they prioritize. Now, Erdoğan has said that he wants to move these 2 million people into these areas. Look, I think that would be tantamount to ethnic reengineering. There is nothing in these areas. One of the reasons that they were able to move so swiftly is that these areas are basically depopulated and rural. There is no urban structures. There's no infrastructure to support 2 million people. There's no local economy. There's nothing.
Does that mean that plan is as delusional as the oil idea?
Yes, it is delusional as the oil idea. I mean, think about the logistics it requires to move 2 million people. And they didn't get the full zone. They got a tiny little space between Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain out to the M4. I mean, they didn't get much out of the invasion. I mean, they got a lot politically and militarily, but creating space to resettle people. And by bringing the regime back in, Ankara essentially was presented with a choice. They had the U.S. plan for the quote unquote security mechanism or safe zone. I don't care whichever one you want to use. They had it was the U.S. and modus vivendi with the SDF, or it was Russia and modus vivendi with the regime. They chose Russia and the regime. I mean, that's just what they did. And when the regime ends up back on the border, people are not going to want to go back. At least I don't assume. Maybe they will, because the majority of these people inside of Turkey, I hesitate to use the word refugee, because Turkey doesn't refer to them as refugees. They are invited guests because of the territorial exception that they have to the Geneva to the whatever that Geneva refugee thing is. I can't remember off the top of my head the name of it. Mm-hmm. But my point is that if the regime really does establish these 15 observation posts along the border, and you have Russians and Turks patrolling inside this zone, that's not really a safe space for people to go back to. Two, nobody's going to fund this 27 billion euro sort of pipe dream of building buildings and infrastructure inside this zone. The U.S. won't do it. I doubt the Europeans will do it, which leaves the cost of this to Ankara. So what Ankara has done, it's dealt with its security problem, at least momentarily, by sweeping the YPG off the border. But it's actually assumed control of governing of more Syrians, which is contra to what Erdoğan was talking about. So I don't actually think there is a coherent plan here on Ankara. I think there are military objectives. I think they've mostly been met. But now the political process is very much in flux. And they tried to get rid of some refugees by sending them back to Idlib. They're using tactics that we've seen in Lebanon, that we've seen in Jordan, which is we don't deport people, right? We don't round them up and deport people, but we get much more judicious in how we enforce local laws. And the punishment for refugees stepping outside those local laws is deportation. Deportation, or sort of you either go to jail or you can go back to Syria. And so people were choosing to go back to Syria. But even this elicited such an outcry from the international community, they were pushed on the defensive and either stopped doing it so publicly or slowed it down. And as we've some people, not me, experts have followed the flow, people would go back to Idlib and smuggle themselves back across the border. So Turkey, through Peace Spring, has achieved a military objective. But in doing so, the Assad regime has come back. It's not safe. There's no infrastructure for these people. And the sort of optics of rounding up 2 million people and shoving them into a tiny little zone, I think is too much for the Erdogan government to absorb. So I don't think the safe zone and the ethnic cleansing, as defined by the movement of mostly Aleppan Syrians into the northeast, is going to actually take place. So I would call it an incomplete on grading the political outcomes of Peace Spring. But, we'll see how Erdogan wants to deal with it.
Okay. You mentioned sanctions earlier. The U.S. House of Representatives is expected to vote this week on new sanctions against Turkey, while Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has cautioned lawmakers to think carefully before sanctioning Turkey, which would push Ankara, quote, into the arms of the Russians. What's your view? Should the U.S. go ahead with further sanctions against Turkey? Do you think it will?
I mean, I don't think sanctions matter. I mean, I don't know why we would sanction Turkey other than we're upset with them and we wave our finger. But it's very difficult to sort of justify sanctioning Turkey when, the first readout after the Erdogan-Trump phone call, Sunday, I think it was October 6th, was, essentially we're getting out of the way. I understand.
Switched his position numerous times since then, but yes.
Yes, I mean, the U.S. has tried to walk that back, but the first readout is the first readout, and that was clearly dictated by Trump. I mean, I don't understand the point of collapsing Turkey's economy or even threatening to do it for an invasion of Syria. Now, I do sympathize with the exacting costs on Turkey for its purchase of S-400. But the Trump administration has been holding back on implementing CATSA. For two reasons. One, out of deference to a last-minute effort to try and get Turkey to either box up or ship out the S-400, and in doing so, in return for no sanctions and perhaps a pathway back into the F-35 program. And two, because the Trump administration has long maintained, and not entirely incorrectly, that CATSA is unconstitutional. And so why should it follow through on the imposition of sanctions for something that is against the Constitution and undermines executive power? I do think that that CATSA will eventually be enacted, and that will be the sanctions that Turkey faces over this, maybe after Erdogan's November 13 visit to the U.S., if that actually goes through. And in terms of the other sanctions bills that are going around the House, they range from extreme to sort of more sober. And I'm thinking of the Reich-Menendez bill, which is essentially to join the European Union arms embargo, but just for things related to Peace Spring. That would be a slippery slope, but perhaps the one that would be the lowest hanging fruit in addition to CATSA. But again, the U.S. Congress has a lot of things on its plate, most of which don't involve Turkey, most of which are focused on the impeachment of Donald Trump.
You mentioned the S-400s. There have been reports that Trump or U.S. officials are still negotiating with Turkish officials behind the scenes in an effort to secure the purchase of U.S.-made Patriot missiles to replace the S-400s, which would, I guess, as you said, maybe would then be boxed up or just mothballed. It's not too late for this to happen. I mean, Turkey has already received some S-400 shipments, obviously.
I mean, the goalposts keep moving. But, by any significant measure, Turkey has met the threshold for CATSA sanctions, which is defined as a significant transaction. Money's been transferred. Elements of the S-400 have shown up in Turkey quite ostentatiously with live video, which was very helpful to analysts like me, but sort of rubbing the Americans' face in the feces of this deal. I think basically the lesson of the hesitation to use CATSA on Turkey is that despite all of this, despite all of the tensions over Syria, despite all of the tensions with Erdogan, from the fight at Sheridan Circle to the imprisonment of Pastor Brunson to Reza Zarrab, to the Attila case, is that nobody wants to actually sanction Turkey. People want Turkey to come back in from the cold as it's described over here, because people don't want to alienate a NATO ally. I do think the dam will break eventually. One just hopes that the dam breaks in a modular way rather than just all at once with some of these sanctions bills that are going around. But is it possible to put for Turkey to buy Patriot at this November 13th meeting with Trump? Sure, anything's possible. But a negotiation entails a give and take on both sides. Turkey never gives; it only takes. So until Ankara shows a willingness to make a concession to the U.S., however marginal. I wouldn't even describe these things as negotiations. I would describe these as American proposals to Turkey that are never acted upon.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last question for you. What else might we expect this Trump-Erdoğan meeting in 2 weeks?
I mean, you never know. Donald Trump is completely unpredictable. Erdoğan is not afraid of Trump. Erdoğan has learned to manipulate Trump, and Erdoğan has been able to influence Donald Trump's personal talking points, not the talking points that he's briefed on. You have to give Erdoğan credit. The AKP identified sort of, I think in October 2016, that Trump was their guy. Despite, even my reading of Donald Trump, I thought Donald Trump would be an Islamophobe that would work against Turkish interests. I think that was shared in the analytical community. But I think the Turks rightly concluded that Donald Trump was corruptible. And not very smart, and therefore he was manipulable.
Sort of took the Putin view.
Say that again?
Sort of took the Putin view.
Yeah, is that he could be a transactional partner that would work towards Turkey's interests. It took 3 years, but ultimately they got it, which was the withdrawal from northeast Syria. I think it took longer than the Turks had expected. They didn't realize, I still don't think they realized the extent to which Turkey defenders within the American bureaucracy have grown small in number and relatively isolated. But they have the most important American, which is Donald Trump. And so the November 13th meeting, look, they're always wild. Donald Trump always says something really silly and that's entirely inaccurate about the history of U.S.-Turkish negotiations about Patriot. So, I mean, it's always buckle up. It's buckle up, and we're going to see. I would make no predictions about what Trump will do, other than Erdoğan played his cards right. He got another face-to-face meeting with Trump where he can present his case, and when he gets a meeting with Trump, Trump usually capitulates to his point of view. Usually, there's efforts to push back on that in the days after to clean up the mess that Trump leaves behind him. But, every time that happens, Erdoğan moves the ball forward in his interests. Mm-hmm. So we're going to see.
Okay. Aaron Stein, thank you so much for your time and insight.
No, my pleasure.